All right, let's get started. Thank you all for coming on this rainy evening. So this panel is about the rule of law effort in Afghanistan. And just to state the obvious, the war in Afghanistan is more than a decade old. Last year, President Obama announced that we would have a strategy of being out by 2014. The Taliban are for the most part out of power. Al-Qaeda is for the most part out of Afghanistan. And yet, Afghanistan remains front page news. Just Monday, we heard about a suicide bombing that killed 14 people, including the head of a provincial capital in northern Afghanistan. And I think that this really underscores something that Vice Admiral Mike Mullen, who was the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said, which is we can't kill our way to victory in Afghanistan, right? We need something more. In 2010, Brigadier General Mark Martins assumed command of a newly established rule of law field force, Afghanistan. And he argued that success of the rule of law effort was absolutely critical to an enduring transition, an enduring success, basically, of our military effort there. But establishing to our eyes what looks like the rule of law is, to put it mildly, a highly ambitious undertaking in a war-torn country that has been resisting efforts to impose Western systems of government for almost 200 years. One thing seems pretty clear. The US and its allies have, at this point, undertaken a comprehensive approach to judicial institutional capacity building in Afghanistan on a new scale. And the effort has really pushed the boundaries of both traditional civilian State Department involvement and especially military intervention. And there have been both successes and failures, and I think it's fair to say that it remains a work in progress. We're fortunate to have with us tonight three recent veterans of the rule of law effort in Afghanistan, and they'll each sort of give us their boots on the ground view of what's been happening there. So to introduce, starting on my left is Dominique Day, who came back last month. Until then, she was senior rule of law advisor for the State Department at the US Embassy in Kabul, working on legal aid and protection for vulnerable groups and gender issues. Prior to that, she served as a State Department senior rule of law advisor in Basra, Iraq. Dominique also practices in New York and nationally and is an experienced criminal defense attorney, complex civil and commercial litigator, and a nonprofit manager. To her left is Art Cody. Art Cody is a member of the Capital Punishment Committee of the Association of the Bar of the City of New York. He has authored numerous articles on the death penalty with a focus on the intersection of capital punishment and religion. He's also a West Point graduate and a retired Navy Reserve captain with tours of duty in Panama, Dominican Republic, Germany, Egypt, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Korea, as well as Afghanistan. He served aboard the USS Enterprise after September 11, 2001, and most recently he completed a one-year tour at the US Embassy, again in Kabul, Afghanistan, as staff director of the Interagency Rule of Law section, where he advised the embassy on the Afghan capital punishment system. And Art and Dominique have a book coming out that they've co-authored entitled Afghanistan's Death Penalty at the Crossroads. And finally, on the far left is Scott Carlson. Scott has 2 decades of experience developing, implementing, and evaluating complex international rule of law assistance programs. Before recently returning to the private sector, in 2011, he served as US Department of State's technical director for the Interagency Rule of Law Office, and I'm still learning what all these things are, the joint civil-military organization tasked with planning, coordinating resources, and synchronizing rule of law efforts across Afghanistan. He designed and managed and provided expert assistance on international rule of law programming for the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement and the Office of the Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization, serving as an advisor in various countries, including Haiti and Lebanon, as well as a delegate to international organization working groups such as the UN Access to Justice Working Group. Prior to that, he provided senior rule of law programming assistance at several renowned international development organizations, including the United Nations Department for Peacekeeping Operations, where he was contracted to develop their primer for justice components in multidimensional peace operations. And that manual is still in use at the UN. So we're going to start off with a presentation from Scott, sort of to give us a little bit of an overview.
Thanks, Maya. And I'd also like to thank everyone for braving the weather. I know it's quite a deluge. I emerged in Madison Square Garden just at the end of it, and everyone looks here remarkably dry. So I'm hoping that means you all avoided it. So we served in a civ mil context, and so a PowerPoint is absolutely necessary. You just cannot avoid that, and we joke about that, but in the taste and smell and feel that we'll try to give to you tonight about our experiences in Afghanistan, some of those jokes have a larger meaning, and you should feel free in the questions and answers to tease out what we mean if we're unclear or if it seems a little bit abstract. I should say as I start that I'm going to give you a snapshot of time, and you actually have, you think about I'm the dinosaur here, and here
I'm closing in on it.
Art's Mastodon, and Dominique's Homo sapiens in the timeline.
That worked out well for me.
It did.
I was waiting to see where I ended up.
Yeah, it worked out very, very well for you. Because I arrived at the beginning of 2011. Art came shortly thereafter, and I somehow managed to persuade Dominique to join us from Basra sometime after that. And we sort of left in sequence as well. So, but what I wanted to do was to kind of put in perspective what I think is the recent push and what are some of the positive and negative aspects about what happened. And by recent push, I want to orient everyone in time. So if I'm a dinosaur, we're looking at the pre-dinosaur stage of U.S. involvement in Afghanistan. And we all agreed that what we're talking to you tonight about is our experience as U.S. Foreign policy implementers. So we understand there are various perspectives out there that are equally valid, but what we're going to try to do tonight is share with you that perspective. So prior to about 2008, 2009, one of the big critiques in the think tank community was that there wasn't really a rule of law strategy in Afghanistan. We'd done some stuff, we'd done some projects, but the large bulk of the resources that had been promised at the various international conferences was going to other things, particularly military kinetic operations, because as we all know, the situation in Afghanistan has never quite stabilized, even to this day. So what I'd like to do is take you through the snapshot of once I think the U.S. and the NATO allies really got serious about ramping up the resources and how that looked. And hopefully give you an appreciation for the complexity of that challenge, where there's some points of success and limitation. And then my colleagues are going to drill down in different aspects of that. And there's going to be some acronyms here. Don't worry about them. Just think about what the concepts are and feel free to ask questions. So this IROL office that Maya described in the intro, this was our mission statement. This is what I came in and was told our office was supposed to do. And as you read this, and I won't read it to you, you can read it for yourself, I'll just give you a little bit of history. This really emerged in about the 2009-2010 timeframe. It came from some State Department cables which were shared with the Department of Defense, and some back and forth in which there was an understanding that if they were going to do something that was meaningful for Afghanistan, and by Afghanistan I mean the average citizen as well as the government, that there was going to have to be a more coordinated effort and there was going to have to be more resources. There's three things that we sort of have teased out of this mission statement that we used, and one was to try to have unity of effort. You know, if the military was, doing something, Maya referred to the Rule of Law Field Force Afghanistan, or RALF-A as that acronym was called. If they were doing something in a Kandahar area, and there's a civilian counterpart working there, make sure that they're working together. They're not duplicating resources or sending mixed messages to the counterpart. And that would hopefully institutionalize enhanced coordination, because there are times when, even when you are spending millions of dollars, you can't reach. Afghanistan is a huge country with a very difficult terrain, which is dramatically different. And so where you can have some other group maybe carry materials or do some of the training that you might otherwise do because they're already going to be there, it's a great idea to do it. And then last, but certainly not least, is when you're doing all these things, are you collecting data on what's happening and what's the results of your efforts? And then are you thinking about that so that you can refine those? So that's how we in the office unpack the mission statement. Now here's what we were faced with. This was the structure that when we came in, we were supposed to be dealing with. And if you look right here, this is that IROL office that I was talking about. But you recognize many of these acronyms. United States Agency for International Development, FBI, International Security Assistance Forces for Afghanistan, which is basically the NATO multinational group. The bureau that was my home bureau at State Department, International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, U.S. Marshals, this Special Task Force 435 that dealt with the detention of high-value detainees at Bagram. So it's a very complicated structure, but the idea was on top of this you would have a civilian leader who at the time I was there was Ambassador Hans Klem, and they later had a different ambassador, and a senior military deputy, a one-star in both the cases that I think where we served. And the idea was this committee would meet once a week and look at what was happening in the field and issue decisions to try to do those things we just talked about, unity of effort, enhanced coordination, and things of that nature. Unfortunately, it didn't really work out quite like that. And here's where I'm going to give one of the critical lessons learned. Just look at these agencies. They all have very different mandates. A DEA person in Afghanistan is really going to be worried about opium production, right? Now, they may also care that the courts are having a difficult time prosecuting drug dealers, but they're maybe going to be a little bit more focused on seizure and some things like that. So to cross some of these divisional lines and really have a robust conversation, it really meant that at this working level, that this IROL office where we all worked in would have representatives who were ground level folks, who were in the day-to-day nitty-gritty. And so by the time we met on Sunday afternoon at this deputies committee meeting, they really knew the taste and smell of what was happening in Afghanistan. The problem started when some of these groups did not actually commit their resources at that working level. Many did, and Art, Captain Cody was an example. The military put in. But on the civilian side, when I arrived, we had a DEA person. He was there for about 2 weeks, and then he went to Pakistan. We never saw anyone from DEA again at the working level. Now, of course, they would show up at the policy and decision-making meetings, but they hadn't been involved in any of the day-to-day work. And when I say day-to-day work, here was our day-to-day work. First meeting I had was a telcon at 8 o'clock in the morning with the ambassador every day. You worked 7 days a week. You had 2 mornings off, Friday morning and Sunday morning. Your hours were 8 in the morning till 9 at night. And that was authorized by the U.S. ambassador. So we're talking a punishing work week where you should find time to be able to talk about those things. But the problem is if those representatives haven't been appointed, there's no one there to chat with. So that's the first critique that I would like to highlight in an already complicated picture. So how did we get to that point? Well, I wanted to show you this. This is the diagram of how the policy and the guts of the machine is supposed to work. And I think Art's going to show you a diagram which is even scarier shortly. But This should scare you sufficiently.
There'll be a quiz on this later.
Yeah. So at the top, you have these different interests: national security accounts, Office of the Secretary of Defense, Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, and they all have their ideas. But think about it. These guys are flying at about 50,000 feet. Then you get down to our level, which I've just explained to you, which was the Deputies Committee. And then underneath this, you have all these different agencies, and I won't go into each one of those, but they're running around and they're doing activities. They're training judges, they're training defense counsel, they're helping set up transparency measures, hopefully to stop things like the Kabul Bank episode from happening, or if it does, prosecute accordingly. And we were saddled with trying to, as you can see, keep on top of these lines of effort, but these guys didn't really answer to us. And so when it came to collecting information from the district level and all these different groups, it took Dominique and Art and myself being charming in the large part, and hoping that we could get that information out of our colleagues. It was not because anyone had ill will that we wouldn't get that information, but when we're working those 7-hour days, it's punishing, and at the end of your day, a lot of people are just rolling back to their bunk. So that kind of hampered this information from getting synthesized and pulled back up here to the policymakers. So what I wanted to describe to you is not that that was a complete failure, because we in fact did get a lot of information up, but it was such a challenge to do that just because of the entire setup and the complexity of what we were facing. After being in the country for about 7 or 8 years and having criticism from the think tank community and other quarters, the U.S. government came up with a strategy. And this is what it looked like. This actually wasn't published, though. This was a national security document at the time. But we knew that this was the key emphasis that was coming from D.C. Now, when I left, it had been under revision and review for 8 or 9 months. I don't know if you guys, when you were there, if there was any change.
So it got finished, and then it went back with the new
Right.
deputy ambassador.
Okay.
And so I think Cade now has fast-tracked it. It may have just passed. It was
Okay.
It was close when I left.
Okay, so refining this, just the act of refining this, took several years, and it was no small accomplishment that it got done, and that there was agreement at that high level. And this actually helped organize the flow of assets and activities and programs in Afghanistan. This is unpacking that a little bit more. So how did we then try to operationalize that? And there were 4 LOEs, or lines of effort. First was sort of access to justice and state capacity. The second was taking care of detentions and corrections. Anyone who knows anything about Afghanistan knows that pretrial detention is a scandal. People, are in, detention facilities for, years, and it's just because there, wasn't a system in place to check and get people out. People finish their sentences, and they still stay incarcerated because they weren't really aware of when their sentence was up. The third one was security and traditional dispute resolution. And this one was maintained by the U.S. despite President Karzai's very public statements that he did not like that, because he viewed any sort of access or support to traditional justice mechanisms as something that could imperil the state and strengthen the Taliban. Obviously, there is some truth in that, and I know Art's going to talk some more about the traditional justice areas, but a USAID program, I think, is still going on to this date that works with them. But what they try to do is help integrate those traditional justice systems into the formal system so that both sides come out winners. And then the last and probably the toughest nut to crack in these 4 lines of effort is bolstering the justice sector leadership. As many of you hear on the news, the Afghan government is rife with corruption at senior levels, and building up the capacity of the Afghan government, or JAROA, the as the acronym is thrown about and used here, is tough. So after a period of time where the strategy had been in place, these different lines of effort had been working, the idea was, now let's bring together the civilian and the military and make them work together. And the way it was thought to do it was through this provincial justice center concept. And what this was, in short, and Art's going to talk more about it down at, as we would say, the granular level, it was an effort to say, okay, everyone who's working in this province, let's make sure we get certain things right and we work together. And you civilian, you military actor, we're going to identify who you are, and we're going to make sure that there's regular discussions between you about activities that are coordinated. And the idea was, within each one of these provincial justice centers, because Afghanistan is such a tough climate, you'd have a hub and you'd have little spokes. The hub would be a larger population center, which was pretty safe. Spokes, a little bit more dangerous. So maybe you would send a judge out there for a period of time and they would come back to the hub, you know, if the situation became kinetic or more violent. And here's what they look like. Here's what was ultimately chosen. Kandahar, Herat, Balkh, Nangarhar, and Khost. And you know, outside of the capital areas for these provinces, you would have your spokes. They wanted to add Helmand, which was run by the British, and Kunduz by the Germans, but I don't know that that ever happened. I think that fell by the wayside. In any case, the notion here was that if these worked, you would cover, and they had done this, census data is very sensitive in Afghanistan. There hasn't been a public census since the Soviet times. They would cover about 22% of the population now. And so if you think about it, if these coordinated efforts worked, you would have about 1/5 of Afghans seeing U.S. assistance, NATO assistance, other foreign governments' assistance, working with Afghan leaders to actually provide services to people. So conceptually, you know, quite strong. So what were the nitty-gritty details? Well, for each one of these provincial justice centers, the idea was to try to hit these 4 things. Make sure that investigations really worked, that there was some forensic capacity to do it. Stop just holding people in pretrial detention. If you don't really have anything on them, you know, but you just want them to sell the goat to your uncle for a fair price, your version of a fair price, let them out. Prosecutions. There needed to be pay parity for prosecutors. There was a big debate for why they should be paid differently, but they also wanted some minimum standards. There were many prosecutors that weren't literate, and so they were trying to come up with a situation where they rationalized the existing structure without throwing out people who had the trust and legitimate standing in the community. Public trials, there was a big push to have public trials, no more secret trials, and have them reach some minimum standards. In terms of corrections, what you would imagine, there's gross overcrowding in many facilities, and they wanted to make sure that that stopped. But also to beef up security. I mean, we all have heard of 2 massive Kandahar breakouts with these tunnels, med stations built in there. I mean, you almost would think they would have a Starbucks, you know, in the tunnel system. And what was happening? Well, they know now that there was a very sophisticated operation run by the Taliban to sneak out dirt that was coming up out in buildings at remote locations from those prisons. But they wanted to beef up the Afghan capacity to detect those types of things. So we did manage to get that sort of structure in place. We got the ROLF-A team that Maya mentioned. INL had 2 programs, USAID had a couple, and we began to sort of coordinate at the Provincial Justice Center level. And right before I left, we did the first metrics. You know, as I mentioned at the beginning, if you're not monitoring and evaluating and looking at what your data tells you, you don't really know if you're allocating resources rationally. prior to those PJC metrics, everyone had the perception that the reason why trials, criminal trials, were languishing and pretrial detention was such a problem is because you didn't have enough prosecutors and judges out there. No one mentioned defense counsel. Well, when we started collecting the data, where do you think we found the highest throughput of cases? Well, it was in places which had defense counsel. So here, when we collected data in Balk and Herat, they absolutely blew away these others. There was no comparison how fast they were moving their criminal cases. But they all had pretty decent defense counsel systems. And if you think about it, intuitively, it makes some sense. If a defense attorney is coming into the judge or the prosecutor every day saying, hey, my client's in jail, he's got to feed his family, you need to let him out right now. That's a pressure to keep things moving. There were some interesting lessons learned from that. We briefed out. I'd like to say that the programs benefited that and redesigned accordingly. I have some inside information, at least on the INL side, that some of that did happen. I will say, though, it was a tough exercise because you had to get the military and the civilian cultures to work together and share information. And both wanted to go report to their higher-ups and claim success. And that's the subject of another discussion, but I'll just close by saying that that was no small feat, and it's my understanding that since my departure, they have not been able to run those metrics that they agreed to since. So with that, I will close my remarks and turn it over to I guess it goes to you next.
I think it does.
All right. Click away or do whatever.
Okay. First slide I want to show you, and again, I'm 30 years in the military, and it's really tough to get the PowerPoint out of me, but I'll try to limit the number of times I do go to the PowerPoint. And let's see, where is this? Okay. This is the slide that Scott was talking about. This is, we mentioned it was complicated. Okay, the Afghan rule of law situation is complicated, and it is. This slide is sometimes known as the spaghetti chart. You would find it in a lot of offices in the MC and at the International Security Assistance Force, or ISAC. And sometimes you find the somewhat humorous caption underneath it that would say something to the effect of, if we knew it was this simple, we would have gotten it done. But in reality, this is not an unfair depiction of the things you've got going on. You have that many different complicating factors. And in fact, this kind of just gives you structurally what's going on. But underneath that, you also have the clash of, you have tribal issues going on, you have religious issues going on, you have ethnic issues going on. You also have the resistance or not of the international community's efforts to affect this. And you also have just plain old corruption. So the way we tried to deal with this, and Scott I think pointed out well, was through this this idea of a coordinating director for rule of law and law enforcement. That's the C.D. Broly ambassador. And the only thing I really wanted to point out on this slide, and then I'm going to go into kind of a case study on how this all worked, was you see, and Scott pointed out, you have a fairly significant military presence, you have a fairly significant civilian presence. The idea on this is civilians would be in the lead. Civilians would be in the lead in how we assisted, how we facilitated the Afghans implementing their own rule of law system in their own country. Role play has been mentioned a lot, and that's on the lower left-hand side of the slide. Rule of law, field force Afghanistan. You see there's a slash there with NROLSOM. You get another really tough acronym. They worked really hard to come up with that. But NROLSOM is the NATO rule of law field support mission. Okay? Because NATO's not crazy about using the word force, so they had a mission. All right. One of the main ways, and really the project I was most involved in, was a project called the District Rule of Law Program. And what that was about, and it goes back to a okay. In roundabout 2011, the Afghans realized that they had not only a rule of law problem, they had the stability, security, and perhaps even governmental survival problem. Because in the roughly 400 districts in Afghanistan, more or less 117 had no judge. 88 did not have prosecutors. Defense counsel, while a constitutional requirement, was not something that there was a significant emphasis on. I think Dominique did a great job in trying to raise that awareness. But just a little anecdote, in one of the provinces that I went to called Host Province, I'll show you a picture real quick. In Host Province, I visited the Chief Justice in Host Province. And that's him there in the middle in case it's tough to figure out. And he gave us a really good 2-hour presentation, just as articulate as Scott was, and went into the throughput in his courtroom and how things were moving along and how pleased he was with it, and how he thanked us all for our assistance in terms of infrastructure and the training of prosecutors and those kind of things. Then I asked him at the very end, because as Mike was kind enough to mention at the beginning, I've done a lot of capital defense work. So my interest was kind of piqued, and I said, well, Judge, how do you feel that the defense counsel is doing? Do you think you're some use to your courtroom? He said, because it's an Afghan constitutional requirement to have it. And what he told me was, no, I've never really seen one in my courtroom. The people don't know why they need them, and they don't use them. And part of that, I think, is flat out cultural. Okay? Despite the significant efforts that we put into training and teaching about defense counsel and how important it was and how we increased their throughput, culturally, it's not what they did. Okay? And I would mention, Scott talked about the areas where the throughput was greater had defense counsel. Now, part of that, I think part of the rationale for that was there were parts of Afghanistan, particularly the Pashtun Belt, okay, which really is this area here is the Pashtun Belt, basically rolling from Kabul on down to Kandahar, maybe a little south of Kandahar into Helmand. Okay. In those areas, and particularly further as you got east, and Host is in the east, right about here. Okay, very traditional, very somewhat of a hotbed for the Taliban, and very much resistant to Western ideas. So I wasn't surprised that the provincial chief judge did not see the particular need for defense counsel. Okay. But getting back to 2011, the Afghans realized they had a problem for a couple of reasons. Without the judges, without the prosecutors there, they really didn't have a formal justice system. And what you might say is, well, gosh, you really need a formal justice system. You had an informal justice system that's been in operation for 1,000 years. Problems with that. One, the informal justice system in Afghanistan had a very bad record on human rights. I think it had improved, and improved to some degree during the time we were there. You did see less amputations, but it was still going on. And I think really the most stark problem that we encountered, and we still do encounter it, is the gender rights issue. In terms of what informal justice would do with respect to women. And I think probably the classic example of that was known as the BOD, B-A-A-D. And what the BOD was, it was a Pashtun restorative justice method where, and the idea was not to punish the particular offender, but rather to make the defendant's family and the victim's family satisfied with the result. Okay, so this is somewhat of a scenario that we usually have. family A had a son, family B had a son. Family A son kills family B son. Way out in the more rural areas of Afghanistan, they may not want to go through all the hassle of a trial, certainly not bringing them into the provincial justice centers that Scott talked about. So what they might do is, well, gee, our son killed your son, you're a fairly prominent family, we don't really want to take you through the hassle, we can't take you through the hassle. What we'll do is we'll give you one of our daughters. Okay, so you would have 14-year-old daughters, or numbers like, some ages like that, traded from one family to another. I think that practice has gone down, but I don't think it's going to do it. So while the formal justice system is very well well, the informal justice system is very well accepted. Okay? And really it does about 90% or so, maybe a little less than that, of the civil dispute resolution is done through the informal system, through your suras and your judges. Okay? And so long as they stay within those boundaries of the civil dispute resolution over perhaps a land dispute or a who stole whose chicken dispute, something like that, that's fine. Where we had issues with is when we had the human rights gender issues. And also one of the big problems with the informal system, and Scott mentioned as well, is the because of the lack of literacy, many of the decisions were flat out not recorded. So what would happen is you would have a surer would meet over a land dispute, and they may meet 3 years ago. The land may change ownership, and the dispute may come back again because it's not written. So 3 owners down the line on both sides is, hey, whose side of the fence is the apple of the law? And they would have to go back and have another surer and another surer. And it adds the instability and the violence of the region. Another, and this is more Kabul-centered concern, was that the greater the informal system, the less legitimacy the Kabul government had. Even if the informal system was perfect and had a human rights record like Switzerland, they would still be concerned with it because it took away their legitimacy. In some degree, it took away their resources. The amount of money we spent in the USAID on informal perhaps could have been spent on formal. That was concerned. And the last thing I'll mention on the informal system is the informal system, because it was swift, efficient, albeit brutal at times, it was also perceived to not be as corrupt as the formal system. So the people really bought into it, and culturally the people accepted it. Okay. Problem was, a lot of times, particularly in the Pashtun Belt, it was heavily influenced by the Taliban. In fact, when the Taliban initially had their rise, one of the ways they did it in the birthplace of the Taliban, which is really Kandahar, of that region, they filled that justice vacuum. And because they filled that justice vacuum, people went to them. And that gave them leverage. And from that, they expanded and were able to essentially have their own government. It was even not uncommon when we were there for there to be shadow courts. And you would be aware of, hey, who's the shadow governor in Helmand? There had been an election with an electoral college. But they had shadow government. Okay. So what did the Afghans decide to do about this problem? They knew they needed to insert or enhance their rule of law program, their former rule of law program. First thing they did was like any other good government, they created a working group. First thing we would have done. And they decided in 2 ends. One, they went through, hey, what districts do we want to go to? Okay. And secondly, they wanted to come up with a plan to do that. Okay. And they built somewhat of an internal coalition in the Afghan government, which I think we facilitated, but I think this is somewhat of a success story, at least in the process. That it was an Afghan-led program. You'll see the bottom bullet there is Rolfe. Okay? And one of the primary reasons Rolfe was part of this is because Rolfe had the presence out in these districts. Okay? And if you may remember the slide, slide with the American organization. Okay? You had Rolfe on one side, and you had the ambassador, the civilians in the middle. Okay? What that slide's really going to is the idea that Rolfe, the military, okay, as Scott talked about, there's this military, civilian-military integration. Civilian ambassador in charge, the Rolfe military guys, or the Rolfe guys, when we had NATO involved, being the implementers. Now, one of the criticisms, I don't think Scott's mentioned yet, but one of the criticisms, or one of the real tough things we had to deal with, is you had the military out in the field, and you had the diplomats back in Kabul. And civilians doing the policy side, military doing the implementation side. But the line between implementation and between policy and implementation is large to get blurred. For example, the Rolfe guys are not supposed to be mentoring the Afghan judges or the Afghan prosecutors or defense attorneys who really existed. But literally, you have these hard-charging lieutenants, these guys who are 25, 26 years old, who just got to Afghanistan, they're ready to set the world on fire, and they want to do the right thing. Okay? And they see this prosecutor or this defense attorney and stuff, and help out. So there's something, well, should they be doing that? But really what we kind of came down to is, well, they're filling a vacuum. Because we don't have the presence to go out there and train these judges, and these guys are out there. So a lot of that was, gosh, if they're doing the right thing, we're not going to let policy get in the way of a positive result. Now, things would get modified as the years and months went by, and try to tweak that and keep them in their lanes. But the idea was the military was implementing the policy, and sometimes their policy overflowed into implementation.
Can I just drop a footnote on that? I think one of the successes there was, though, because we had this coordinating structure, the civilians had already, for example, worked on a case registration system, both USAID and INL. And they actually gave training sessions to these military guys so that they would actually then be able to take out the official forms of the Afghan government and actually provide a quasi-governmental service of actually distributing the accurate information in Dari or Pashtun, depending upon where they were going. So it wasn't, and that was an example of the good blurring, because they would know where each other was working because of the shared information, at least to a better extent, and sometimes be able to do carry water for each other.
What the Afghans looked at in this district rule of law program, and then they had really 4 problems: security, tashkil. Okay, tashkil is a Dari word that basically means personnel roster. And if you're over there long enough, your vocabulary gets absolutely infiltrated with Dari and Pashtun words. So, I mean, I think overall that's a positive thing. Anyway, then the other thing that the other 2 things they were concerned with: infrastructure. What kind of these guys going to work out of a courthouse? If they're going to work out of a courthouse, are we going to go to a courthouse? Are the Afghans going to go to a courthouse? What type of courthouse is going to be? Last thing is capacity building. Capacity building was really the training of the judges. Of the judges and the prosecutors. Okay. So they selected 48 districts. Some of the factors that went into the districts were they districts that were already getting U.S. or coalition money? That's that DDP program. Was it a district that we felt was important, because we would influence decisions to some degree? Was it a district that had a high population that we thought we could keep stable? Also, was Rolfe already there? Because then, as we discussed, Rolfe was the eyes and ears, and sometimes they were the hands of U.S. rule of law policy. The second to last bullet is whether the districts were in a PJC province. Okay, PJC being this provincial justice center. Okay. This is the idea of these hubs and spokes. Okay? And when a Navy guy took over Rolfe, they called it anchors and nodes. They couldn't be the same article. And lastly, to some degree, the Afghan society. Now, some of that might have been because of connections in Kabul, or it might have been for reasons in terms of they felt they had a better transportation system than maybe we gave them credit for, but they made a decision as to what these districts were going to be. Okay, and they signed off on it. Now these districts are not exactly, if you look on the right-hand side there and see where the provinces are, some of these provinces are pretty much front-page names. And they're not front page for good reason. You've got your Kandahars, your Helmands, your Nangarhars, your Wardaks, not places you would want to send your kids to daycare. So what happened was it was very tough for the Afghans to get judges to go to these areas. And the way judgeships work in Afghanistan is you get your, as in many European countries, you get your law degree as an undergrad. Then you go through a program called the stage. And what the stage does is it's usually about a 2-year program, and it takes you from lawyer to judge. But they had a problem with getting people who had passed the stage and were admitted to good stage programs who want to go to your Helmands, your Wardaks, your Kandahars. So what they did was they said, hey, all you guys who are 35th percentile and below, tell you what we're going to do. Normally you weren't going to get into law school. Okay? We'll make you catch. Catch is we're not going to make you a judge in downtown Kabul. Okay? We're going to make you a judge in Argadar or Spin Bulldog, both in Kandahar, in some pretty rough places. And the deal was we'll make you a judge in those areas for 2 years, and when you come back, and to some degree it was if you come back, when you come back, you will be you'll get to go through the stage. Okay? So you have people who haven't even gone through the stage who are being judged. You will get to go through the stage at that point, and you'll be a full-blown judge. A lot of controversy over this. It was an Afghan program, but the U.S. did support it through Walfay. But part of the problem was some of the international looked at it and said, okay, is what we're doing, the areas that need judges the most, because they're the most kinetic, or the euphemism we use is less secure. The areas that needed judges the most, we were sending the least qualified judges to. And that was an absolute point of controversy between many of the NATO nations and then the NGOs. In the end game, it's an Afghan-led program that we facilitated and we helped in terms of build the courtrooms, training, to some degree security, but we wanted the program to be, security needed to be run by the Afghans. So in the end, the program, when I left in May of 2012, the second tranche, that is the second group of judges had gone out. It seemed like the program was sticking, it seemed like the program was working. But in terms of real metrics for this are really going to be, when those 2 years are up, how long did the judges actually stay? How secure were they? And what was the throughput on caseload? And I just want to, to get away from PowerPoint just for a second, I just want to show you a couple of pictures. This is pretty typical courtyard scene in a town called Chardar. Okay, Chardar is up north in Kunduz. And what I wanted to point out here, you have me on the left from the embassy. The woman who's one over is an Air Force Captain Jag, okay, who's wearing the traditional headwear, and she is the RALF A officer out there. She meets the guy on the far right, in fact, the guy on the far left. Guy on the far right. Okay. He is the provincial judge of Kunduz province. Okay, and to his right is what's called the Hukuk. Okay. The Hukuk essentially was where the formal system met the informal system. Remember how I talked about decisions weren't written down? What the formal system was supposed to do, his job was to write down those decisions so there would be some precedential value. We want to keep on trying to stay so. The guy in the middle, State Department field support rep. Okay? And he's really giving the policy to the raw pay rep. But the raw pay rep is really the implementation, the day-to-day implementation, and being there every day. And that concludes my portion. I'm going to turn it over to Dominique to talk about
right.
some of the other issues we had in respect to gender among them.
Thank you. And Dominique is the most recent returnee, just back about a month. And we heard from Scott about the critical role of the Defense Council. You were working with Defense Council, right? So what was that like?
You know, I really liked it. I was in Afghanistan for about 1.5 years, and I'd been in Iraq for a year before that. And in both roles, I was able to work with the defense bar and individual defense attorneys and legal aid NGOs. It was a very central part of my role in Afghanistan. It was more ancillary in Iraq. But I really, you know, this is the thing. Afghanistan, if you look at the law, back to 1965, there's laws allowing for the right to counsel, or allowing for the provision of counsel. Not necessarily indigent counsel, they were highly underutilized. And then the court system itself was a little bit different. But the idea of defense counsel wasn't foreign at all. It wasn't necessarily being used as much, and there wasn't a thriving legal aid, free legal aid crowd. Now there's a lot more of that in Afghanistan, but what we're seeing, even now, there's a bar association. It started in 2009, they had their first General Assembly. I might be a year or two off on it. But they had 250 people. It was the first class of defense attorneys in the Bar Association. The Bar Association there is a little bit like a mix between our Bar Association and our state bar. So it's both a licensing and disciplinary committee and a professional association that advocates on behalf of attorneys who are in somehow troubled. In Afghanistan, you see a good number of defense attorneys getting beaten up for advocating for their clients. Defense attorneys who try to go into the National Director of Security, which is their intelligence directorate, to represent clients who are being held in like a black box, often found themselves physically assaulted and locked up for themselves. So the Bar Association, which is underwhelming in some ways, has really done a great job of stepping up when their members are being completely abused for the most basic acts of legal defense. And now, you know, 5 years later, the Bar Association has almost 2,000 members. And so you've seen a tremendous growth of that. As of maybe 2 months ago, 300 of those were women lawyers. There's been a ton more women coming out of the law schools in Afghanistan. You're seeing classes of 20–25% women. And then, you know, the Bar Association is not cheap there. People are paying $85 a year, which I don't know how many of you guys are members of the bar here. We pay like, what, $250, $350 every 2 years? Do I pay? I don't pay every year.
I think we're supposed to pay every year.
It's a semi-annual thing.
They send me a blue form every 2 years. Oh, yeah, the state bar. I'm sorry. Yeah, the state bar. In order to stay licensed here, you're paying a comparable amount of money. A little teeny bit more, but, you know. So, you know, what you've seen is the development of a thriving defense bar. It's still highly underutilized in the courts, highly disfavored, and we do still have this problem. You know, let me step back for a second. You know, my job, in some ways, I'm sorry, was the best job that existed in Afghanistan. I had the opportunity to, within this context, test and assess the success of our policy goals. Right? We, as U.S. government folks, and it's funny, I had never worked for the U.S. government before except when I was a law clerk, but as U.S. government employees, we had a set of policy goals, and because of the interagency tension, because of the mounting pressure from the media, you would see every agency reporting out successes, and yet when you look at the big picture, I mean, you guys probably have seen the media, it's hard to look at Afghanistan as an unqualified success, right? But you would look at the data people are giving you, and I went out to all the PJC areas where they sort of had decentralized resources, and you talk to the judges. I've been to every one of these provinces. You talk to the judges, you talk to everybody. Everyone tells you everything is going great. They're fantastic. They could use a little more money, and yet, you know, they're getting plenty of money, and you're not necessarily seeing successes. And so my job, I was working with women. I worked a little bit with gay Afghan, it's not gay, but LGBTI Afghans, and with poor people, and I really had the opportunity to see whether our policy goals were actually affecting people at the ground level. And then also, the flip side of that is to try to build some human capital so you have some demand for accountability on the part of the, on the part of the government. So, should I continue?
Go ahead.
Okay. So I thought I would tell you guys a few stories, because these guys have given you a lot of structure, just to show you like how that played out. We have poured, you and I, through our taxes, maybe not you, have poured millions of dollars into Afghanistan to fight corruption. And there have been some modest gains. But by the same token, I was in Jalalabad about 4 months ago, and a defense attorney, and you may have read about this, was reported in BBC, a defense attorney, a female defense attorney, Susan Sadat, one of the first attorneys in that province, had taken her client's, Afghan lawyers love to do sting operations, it's like their favorite thing, had reported a judge trying to force her client to marry him in order to grant her request to break her engagement. So either she could pay a few $1,000s or she could marry the judge, and if not, she was not going to get the justice for which she had approached the court system. Obviously, the Afghan constitution, international law do not contemplate marriage to the judge as an acceptable solution, right? So this thing is going on and on and on. They're trying to get the defense attorney out. This defense attorney is this amazing woman. Her name is Susan Sadat. She's probably been an attorney, less than 10 years, but she does good work. She started in the prosecutor's office. She had to be covered from head to toe, and they didn't let her do any cases. They only let her make tea. And so she quit that job, became a defense attorney, and ultimately facilitated the recording of this judge making marriage proposals and vague threats to her client, which was then used to present it to the Chief Justice of the district. And when that didn't necessarily work as well as we had hoped, it got released to the BBC. One judge got transferred, another judge disappeared across the border. But to this day, Susan Sadat is in hiding in Kabul. Mm-hmm. She can't practice. I visited her in hiding and spoke to her at length. She cares tremendous. She works for an NGO that it's incorporated here and in Afghanistan called Women for Afghan Women. She's one of their attorneys. She doesn't expect to be able to practice again anytime soon, and she's stuck. She's in Kabul. She can't do anything. It turns out the judge who she got removed had close ties to a parliamentarian who has close ties to a powerful warlord, and so, without knowing it, she had placed her life in danger beyond the risk that she was willing to accept, and she's been receiving death threats. Her client, same deal. Her client is also in hiding in Kabul. These people are from Jalalabad, which is in the eastern, it's in Nangarhar province, it's in the eastern part of the country. It's a very fruitful province, a very rich province, but it's on the Pakistani border. And she's stuck. So she actually did this amazing act to try to sort of target corruption. The chief judge of the province, who's a great guy, his name is Fadl or something like that, he followed up and, with some pressure from the media, facilitated an investigation. Even Kabul, with some pressure from the media, the Professor Sawari's Control and Monitoring Committee, which is sort of the disciplinary committee for the judges, followed up. But the two principal people who put their lives on the line remain in hiding in Kabul, don't have a clear solution. And they both feel strongly that these judges will find their way back to the bench. So, we have a policy goal of anti-corruption. We saw a win in the fact that these judges, and one of the judges was on the bench for 50 years. These judges were ultimately sanctioned, but, we see the victims in hiding. There's a belief that these judges will be back on the bench. And so a lot of my job really involved looking into the backstory and seeing whether our policy goals were in fact being achieved.
And what did the rule of law program do to address a situation like that?
Well, our role was largely policy, right? So when we're enacting programs, we had a small grants program. When we're enacting programming, when we're talking to people, we're trying to we're trying to drill down on whether our policy is working. So this is what we do. I wrote a cable about it, right? We ultimately end up doing a series of interventions to help reveal the problem. The woman remains in hiding. There's probably a question at some point if some embassy or some country will offer her asylum or shelter. And we'll see. We'll see sort of how it plays out. But there's a variety of programmatic interventions, and people are doing that. There's a lot of implementers on the ground. But for me, what I liked about my job is that I was able to sort of get into the details of what was going on the ground and filter them back up to the rule of law ambassador to say, you know, we have this policy goal. Here's how it's playing out below your radar. The same thing was true. I did a good amount of work with LGBTI Afghans, which is a completely invisible group of people that I targeted through the public health community. They were doing some STD containment, anti-HIV work, and a variety of interventions to try to work with the very poorest of these. This was mostly men, although I did meet a trans man while I was there. And it turned out, I just went to talk to them. I went to talk to 25 of these MSMs, men who were having sex with men. And it turns out another 20 of them had recently been rounded up and arrested during a birthday party. And, you know, I'm asking like, well, was there, you know, homosexuality is illegal in Afghanistan. Were people doing something? Was there alcohol, which is also illegal in Afghanistan? It was like, no, the party hadn't even started. And so I said, well, who are their lawyers? Like, you know, that's the type of thing we will do, right? When you're working as a diplomat, you can sort of make a few calls. You can see how things are going. You can let the Afghan legal community know that you're keeping an eye on something, and sometimes that promotes justice, and you know sometimes it blows up in your face. And it turns out they had no lawyers. They had no idea of their right to counsel. Even the leadership of this organization, these were medical doctors, had no idea that these men who had been rounded up were in this black box. They were, you know, in the Kabul detention center. Had no, you know, nobody knew when they were going to get out. Usually when they got arrested, they told me, they paid a few $100s or paid with sex and were able to come home within a few days. This had far outstripped that. So I told them, listen, there's free legal aid in this country. We were funding some of those programs. So get me their names, I'll get them lawyers tomorrow. So a few weeks later, after their attempt to raise money and pay a bribe failed, the prosecutor took their money and never released the men. They had promised to get them out during Ramadan, and it just didn't happen. So a few weeks later, they come to me, and I'm like, okay, so we set up a meeting for the next day with a legal aid NGO, free legal aid, great lawyers. They had been trained and supported by the U.S. government and the international community. I, of course, am running late, and I'm in a car, and I get a call from the international mentor for the NGO who said, they won't even come in until you get here. This is the outreach workers, right? These guys are in jail. The outreach workers, leadership in the NGO, wouldn't even come into the meeting until I got there because they were so terrified of accessing any of any part of the justice sector, even legal aid, even defense attorneys who are by law their advocates. We had a meeting. It was great. It was better than I expected. The head of the quasi head of this legal aid NGO was outraged that these men had been locked up. They had been to the prison the day before. He couldn't get in to see them because they rejected the visitor. And he kept saying, this is not constitutional. He had seen the prosecutor's files. There wasn't a shred of evidence against them. And he was very upset. He's like, we will litigate this. We will win. He was, you know, he suggested that the two men the outreach workers who came, one of whom was, we would use the word trans, but you know, they don't necessarily have the same identity structure as we use. It just suggested that he should stay in Afghanistan, he shouldn't flee, that they had to start fighting for constitutional equality. And they went to court the next day, or within a couple days. I was not allowed to attend by our security people, who were nothing but an impediment in getting work done. And sorry. The free lawyers were fired by their clients. They had decided that they had been told, supposedly, by the judge and the prosecutor that hiring a lawyer would be an impediment to their case. And these were the stories I heard over and over again. Ultimately, so they fired the lawyers, and they also embarrassed the lawyers. They suggested to the judge that they were tricked into accepting this free counsel. So the lawyers were angry. Ultimately, 8 weeks later, I think it was the end of September, they ultimately went to trial and were acquitted. I spoke to the men. I went back to the NGO. I spoke to the men after they got released. It turns out they had paid bribes to the police, even though 2 of them had been raped in the police station. They paid bribes to the police for better treatment. They paid a bribe in the detention facility for better treatment. They paid a bribe to the prosecutor, and they paid a bribe to the judge. The youngest of the men was a probably 16-year-old. He was initially tried as a juvenile. He paid to be held as an adult, where he would get better treatment. So it turns out in excess of, I don't know, 15,000 American dollars was paid by these 20 men in order to facilitate their release on charges for which there was no evidence at any point, right? And if you think about the fact that the U.S. government has put millions, if not, tens of millions of dollars, maybe more, right? We're looking at an aid regime that's hundreds and hundreds of millions into rule of law. This is in Kabul, right? This is a courthouse in Kabul. None of the defendants had any understanding of their right to counsel. At the point that we secured them counsel, they didn't trust the lawyers and ultimately fired them. And to them, you resolved your problems in the justice system by paying bribes, because that's what they did and that's what they always did. And that's in Kabul, right? So, a lot of my work really involved talking to people who were the consumers of the justice system, which was very consistent with the work I had done in New York and Iraq, and testing whether our policy goals were really being achieved. Because if you look at what some of these agencies what our own agencies are reporting, they'll tell you, well, we've trained all of these judges. The judges are outraged about corruption. The judges say it's the prosecutors say it's the defense attorneys say it's the judges. But when you talk to the people, they don't really have a sense. And Kabul is as central as you're going to get in terms of highly educated public, which obviously it's not. In Afghanistan, you're not seeing a huge sense of awareness of basic legal rights. The same thing has been true with women. I did a lot of work around gender and violence against women and the shelter system. Some of you may have seen in the last week, there's been some reporting around the law to eliminate violence against women in Afghanistan. And it was very recently pushed into Parliament and then withdrawn because it was very clear that there wasn't support for the law as written among parliamentarians. And there's been a lot of media about how that ultimately is not only a sign of the international community's failure, but a big shock that, how are these parliamentarians sort of not supporting it? But again, right, I had the privilege of having a role that really looked into the backstory of that. So this law to eliminate violence against women was enacted by presidential decree in 2010. And the entire time I was there, and I think this is still the case, the U.S. Embassy position was, while it would be great to have this ratified by Parliament, we don't have a Parliament that's receptive, right? Parliament is composed of people from all over the country. There are more illiterate parliamentarians today than there were, government officials in the 60s. A lot of them are incredibly conservative. And even the commentary we've been getting back as it circulated through the Parliament was very, very concerning, really troubling views on what that law should contain. And so it had been our position, it was always the U.S. position and most of civil society's position that don't bring the law back in front of Parliament anytime soon. It's not going to do well. We need to focus on implementation. Because even though this law has existed for 3 years, we're seeing very low rates of prosecution. And again, you go out, I went to Kandahar, I said to the chief judge, how many cases are you, we call them eval cases, how many of these eval cases are you prosecuting? He's like, oh, we've got eval cases, we've got eval. And the chief judge there is a little bit of a mess, as everywhere, to be honest. The one in Nangarhar is a former mujahideen who was came to Congress in the 80s and is now one of the most corrupt people in the country. And so they'll tell you, we've got eval cases, we're prosecuting this law, but you can't actually find them. The Human Rights Commission is taking in, hundreds, if not over 1,000 of these cases per year, but the prosecutions are in the dozens. And a lot of those prosecutions don't actually go anywhere. So we were focusing on, listen, implement the law. Don't focus on changing it. Don't focus on perfecting it. Just start using the law, let it get some force, and then we'll figure out what really needs to be changed, just the way we do it here, just the way they do it in Europe. Some parliamentarians, and a lot of them were female leaders, including Fawzia Koofi, who's going to be running for president. She's actually going to be in New York next week at a fundraiser that I'll be at for Women for Afghan Women. She, I think, in part to raise her profile, really pushed the Women's Commission to push the law in front of Parliament. She was convinced she had the votes. Afghan civil society was opposed to that. We were opposed to that. Ultimately, she did it, right? It got introduced on the floor, and it was a big disaster. But right from the U.S. perspective, the disaster was focusing on a parliamentary ratification that was never going to happen, as opposed to focusing on real implementation of this law, at the ground level. So, I was lucky in a lot of ways. I got to sort of work with people at the very, very ground level, but then also at the policy level to really see what are our policy assumptions, how are they going wrong. Another policy assumption we had was the status of Afghan women, right? Like, we have this issue where we've been putting tons of money into training, but we don't necessarily have a sophisticated group of politicized advocates among women. And it's a big question we had, like, how is this not the case after 10 years? And we say, well, it's cultural, but you see these incredibly strong women who lived overseas for a while. And then they say, well, the women have to have escorts everywhere. They have to have a mahram, which is a male escort, a family escort wherever you go. But I went to a drug program in Kabul about 6 months ago, maybe a little bit more. There was snow on the ground. And this woman, Layla Hadari, had started an NGO called Life is Beautiful, where she worked with opium addicts. Her husband and her children were in Iran. Her husband divorced her because she was doing this. She literally went, there's a, sort of an under the bridge kind of thing. She would go to the place where people were congregating to use opium to shoot, like shooting galleries, and tell people, when you're ready, you come to our camp. And she had a camp where she was living with 40 men, none of whom were related to her. And through her own ingenuity, she got the mullah on her side. She had the mullah come out, the local mullah come out and see what she was doing, see how she was ministering to these men and helping them. She opened a restaurant, which we ate at. And she got the police on her side, although it's hilarious how she did it. The police kept coming in and raiding the place. And finally, she got all the men behind her and she said, listen, there are more of us than there are of you. If you come back again, I'm going to tell my men, like my sons, she calls them, I'm going to let them loose on you. And then the police started protecting them, right? So all of our cultural assumptions say Afghan women cannot live on their own. Afghan women could not live with a group of men who are not part of their family. But this woman is doing it, and she's managed to get support within Afghan civil society to do it. She's an Afghan, no hyphenated passport. So it's actually, it's really interesting because what you see is the culture has a lot more tolerance than you might expect, but that also a lot of what we're doing sort of at the very highest levels, which is typically how the U.S. government interacts with a foreign country, is maybe missing what's going on, sort of on the ground. That's fascinating and colorful and surprising. It shows you there's both more hope and more outrage than you might expect.
I mean, and that's exactly what I wanted to pick up on. It was interesting, Art, when you were talking about the idea of this parallel or traditional legal system, I was reminded of the work of Professor Ian Miller at the University of Michigan, who talks about Icelandic blood feuds, and basically argues actually once you get to know the system and looking at it from a law and economics perspective, it's a perfectly reasonable way to organize justice. And I'm wondering, maybe Scott, if you can talk about, based on your experience in rule of law programs, what kind of metrics do you apply? How do you even start to measure a system that's so different?
Maya, that's a great question. And let me first start and say that I loved how you ended Dominique. Dominique was one of my best decisions while I was out there, and that was to browbeat her into coming from Iraq to Afghanistan. And it really was, it was barely consensual. I'm kidding. She was wonderful from the get-go. But what she's talking about is having really good data about what programs are doing. And I don't think it's any accident, because the Provincial Justice Center metrics, which I ended on, that was phase one. And we were supposed to expand the factors we looked at to get into some of the weeds that Dominique just so wonderfully articulated. And that feeds into your question, Maya, how do we structure programs that actually do that? Well, one of the real big problems here is a lot of those agencies that I pointed out with the laser pointer, they have no experience in that. The FBI is not in the business of training law enforcement agents abroad. That's just not what they do. So many of those actors, the Rolf A people, I mean, God bless that 25-year-old enthusiastic lieutenant, but that's not what they were trained to do. So their instincts, even if they are good and their intentions noble, their framework for how they should be doing their job is not necessarily guided. And it's certainly not a part of the corporate structure of those agencies that were engaged in it. The only group there that really had that experience was the United States Agency for International Development. And they were relegated quite quickly because this was on a scale that they didn't have the capacity for. And they weren't a very popular agency under the administration at the time when both the Afghan and Iraq conflict started. And so in other cases where I have been, which are admittedly in smaller scales, but like in the Balkans, some very serious conflicts, there was a lot more focus on getting some of the detailed data, collating it, and feeding it up to policymakers so that adjustments would be made. Not to say it was perfect, but one of the things that when we first got that Provincial Justice Center metrics together was just getting the military and the State Department, INL, my home bureau, to sit down and say, well, what are your objectives out there? And what are your points of data? And who are you talking to? So that we can then begin to build a data set that gets down to finding out whether or not we're actually meeting our policy objectives. And it took me 4 months just to get INL and the Rolf A group to agree upon what the data points are that they were going to share information on. And then on the day they were supposed to exchange their data, and I'm not joking about this, at 11 o'clock that night, the INL implementer said, oh, I'm sorry, there's a clause in our contract that says we actually can't share that information. And I said, hold on a second. We're all funded by U.S. taxpayers. I have spent almost 5 months. I've talked to everyone under the sun. This was agreed to. That cannot be the right answer. And so I took it back to Washington, and 2 weeks later, those contractors for the State Department had a change of heart and began to share their information. But without that sustained emphasis, without people like Dominique going out there on the front lines and bringing back those stories, there wasn't going to be hope for change. And so to get to Maya's question then, if at the very beginning something had happened akin to what I'm about to do with USAID in Egypt, I'm planning on going out to help them work on a rule of law strategy, where you, at the beginning, before you embark and send out all these resources, you think about what are the main areas where we look like we have problems and we have points of opportunity, and start lining those up and building programs to address those, and also building the metrics to measure them. And so that you create a recursive loop which makes you do better each year. And in the other places I've worked, they have been led by development professionals that have that mindset. Now, it's admittedly not a mindset that's very old. It's really come on in the last 10 to 15 years. And a lot of it came from hard lessons in the Balkans, because there was a lot of waste and lack of accountability, I would say, in the programming, and a lot of not matching objectives with results. And in the inside of, let's take one of the stories Dominique talked about, in this sort of development culture that I'm steeped in, there's a big difference between an output and an outcome. An output is I trained 100 judges. An outcome is 14 of those took the new violence against women law in Afghanistan and took cases to their conclusion in ways that look like it honored the law. That's an outcome. And what has to happen if you do real development programming in the rule of law area is you have to have both. The outputs tell you whether or not you're getting that information out, whether legal awareness activities are occurring, both for judges and the general population. But then you also have to have another layer of measurement that says, are those outputs being translated into outcomes? And there is a vast, well, vast is probably an exaggeration, but a large and growing body of literature about what are some of those metrics. And I've had the good fortune in my past lives to to work on several different ways of doing that. But what stunned me was I didn't see those being used in Afghanistan. Outside of the USAID portfolio, which in the rule of law side was quite modest. We're talking a tenth of the size of the State Department budget, which was maybe a fifth the size of the rule of law field force Afghanistan. So let's remember too, very lopsided budgets. So the real development professionals had a pin drop's worth of impact on creating this sort of atmosphere, this culture of a development approach. Now see, sitting there, I see some kind of puzzled looks. Now, well, why would that be? Well, what's the first rule of a development professional? You're not going to change a culture or a situation overnight. A rule of law program that comes out under USAID, usually it's a 5-year horizon. A State Department, 1 year. A Rolf A, some of those people had 6-month tours. So, I mean, you had completely different mindset. If you're a soldier, 6 months might be a reasonable rotation. You go in, you build a courthouse, you move out. That's not to say that's not a valuable service, but it's a very different mindset. And the promise that all those charts that I showed you held was bringing a cross-fertilization of those mindsets. And unfortunately, I think the stories that Dominique used really illustrate rather poignantly that cross-fertilization didn't take hold. And then, of course, we all know about the financial crisis, and then, as Maya said, the president has said we're transitioning out in 2014. This entire apparatus, which at the height all three of us worked in, has shrunk and will probably disappear, this year even. And so you're really seeing what happened, and to circle it back to Maya's question, the development mindset was never allowed to cross-fertilize and to shape the way that these programs were handled. It doesn't mean that they all were failures and that there weren't successes, but dollar investment for dollar return was never skewed in the correct direction. You had people with the most amounts of money with the least amount of experience and expertise in sort of designing some of these things.
So we have about 5 minutes, and I'd love to give the audience a chance to ask a couple questions. And if we can use the mic, that would allow the video recording to pick you up.
Hi, Scott. Let me ask you this question: where's the policy being made, and how come the people who are making the policy don't have people like yourself making the policy? Why are they of questionable competence, questionable resources, and what needs to be done, and they're not doing it? The second question has to do with sustainability, since I don't see that happening once we leave, that the good things that you've achieved will continue. But so again, how do we reach the politicians? How do we reach Congress? How do we get more money into the right places?
Love that question, Norm. And I'm going to take the first one, and I'm going to throw the second one to Art to talk about the IDLG, because its essence was sustainability. On the first one, one of the things, I've had this question before, and I say to everyone, the State Department is 1 year older than I am. Its last authorization act was in 1961. Senator Lugar tried to get a reauthorization act in the mid-'80s and failed, and recently lost his primary. The State Department is a Cold War institution, with all due respect, lots of lovely, talented people, but it has not been reformulated for the 21st century. And until that happens, you're going to have people who rotate in for political assignments without clear portfolios that are geared towards the issues that you're asking about.
When we talk about this, I'm just going to handle the sustainability question real quick. One of the issues that when I think about sustainability, one of the big issues I think about is the infrastructure. And one of the problems we had was there was a desire, particularly I think for people in the more rural sections who are out away from Kabul, to give their judges, their prosecutors, the best possible equipment they could. Okay. And the judges on the other side, certainly, if you could get them a computer, they would take a computer. Okay. But the problem is you don't have a generator, or if you do have a generator, you don't have gas. And the example I think of is I went to a prison in Host, one of their major prisons, and the warden showed us their generator, big, huge system that one of the European nations had put in. Okay, two problems with the generator. It worked for about a week and then it broke down. Okay, didn't have maintenance for it. Okay. So the U.S. came in and said, "Hey, no problem. We'll fix that. We'll make it more sustainable. We'll give you solar panels, because you're not going to need fuel for that." Solar panels work for a while, but they're not maintenance free. Okay? The training wasn't done. It wasn't a permanent solution, because eventually the solar panels needed work and they broke. So finally what the Afghans ended up doing was they literally put a sunroof in. They cut a hole in the roof. It went down the main corridor of the prison. And that's how they lit the facility. And the thing is, you cannot take, and this kind of goes to one of the things Scott talked about, is the terms of the planning horizons. The real planning horizon is you're really looking at generational. Okay? The effects that we all tried to put in are not the kind of things that are going to work in a year, 2 years, or 3 years. They're really more like 5 years, 10 years. I mean, that's low. It's more like generation. And sometimes people ask me, hey, how do you think it's going to turn out? And the reality is you're really not going to know for about 20 years. Let me put this. If it's going to be successful, you're really not going to know for 20 years. If it fails, you may know sooner than that. But I think one of the things we worked hard at, very hard at, and I had the chance to go to their law schools, a couple of their universities, as well as to their military academy. And we've invested an awful lot of effort into reaching out to the up-and-coming leaders, the Sadats, those type of people, not necessarily her in particular, but those type of people who were still idealistic enough without they thought they could change the country. And a lot of it, I think, Afghan's future will be driven by is whether or not those people truly do incorporate the message. And when the time comes for them to take their places in the Afghan government, whether they will say, well, gee, I want my slice of the pie, because that's what my predecessors did. And by the way, my predecessors are forcing me, or certainly coercing me, into being of the same ilk they are. But if the message has struck home and they take that to heart, I think they can change the government. The last thing on sustainability, I think the idea really is you wanted to give a rudimentary system that would work. We needed to get away from the idea of let's give them a net-centric system so the clerk down in Kandahar can type in who the defendant is, shoot it up to Kabul so there'll be a record in the prison ministry so they know when this guy's going to get out. No. What you really need is a very simple paper-based system where you can indeed something that will work for the Afghans well after we're gone.
So there was another question.
At this point, Osama bin Laden is dead, and the president today said that core al-Qaeda has been decimated. It's a shell of its former self. I think a lot of people are wondering what outcome we're pursuing in Afghanistan at this point, what we're going for. So what outcome do you think that we're pursuing in Afghanistan, and is it realistic?
I think the outcome that's most important is a politically negotiated peace, right? I think we all would agree that you can make your own assessment of how powerful the Taliban is in different provinces and what's going to happen after 2014, but ultimately there is a great hope that there will be a politically negotiated peace that is durable. And there's different components of that, right? Hillary Clinton made a huge deal, and this woman right here is working on a little bit, of women, peace, and security, right? It's an initiative and I can't think of the word, it's like a clinic at Georgetown or whatever, where there's a real idea that if you look at places like Sierra Leone and Liberia, a durable peace that's effective for a country needs to involve the presence of women. And we've seen that in various conflict and post-conflict nations around the world. And there's also a piece that, you need to come to some agreement with the Taliban what that's going to look like. So, I'm as far left as you can get. I wasn't a huge fan of either one of these wars. I have serious questions about the military presence and I have questions about military presence at Port Authority, right? But at this point, it sort of is what it is, and there needs to be a political resolution. It can't be, we're not going to, fight to the death. It's incredibly destructive to Afghan civilians, to American military and civilians. A friend of mine was killed in Afghanistan last week, or a few weeks ago. So the idea is, can we negotiate a peace where Afghanistan has a shot to have the government that's accountable to the people, and where the U.S., finds its way out of a somewhat questionable front-end decision-making process?
To add to what Dominique said, they got to want it. Okay.
Well, and they do. 65% of Afghans are under 25. You talk to these people, they are incredibly engaged in what their country should look like. But they're not in power right now. They do want it, but people respond to violence. And to be honest, it's a country that's been 30 plus years of civil war, decades, millennia of being a
crossroad.
A political crossroads. They're used to hunkering down and waiting for the problem to pass. So there's a cultural mindset that isn't necessarily consistent with the way we think of things as Americans, and we have to accept that. But, when you talk to these people, right, law school there is an undergrad degree, medical school is an undergrad degree. So you have people in their mid-20s coming out as young professionals and very frustrated with what's been happening. They do, I think you'll talk to people, they're incredibly idealistic, they have an incredible amount of agency, way more than we do, around what you should be doing in your mid-20s to forward your country. And, there's a question of whether, and we're helping some of that, and we're probably hurting some of that. Some of our money is probably counterproductive.
I want to add a realpolitik answer to that, which is I think we're going to get out as fast as we can without declaring a loss. And I think that the peak turned when what you may have missed it on that chart, when he talked about rule of law field force, and Brigadier General Martins, who's now the chief prosecutor in Guantanamo Bay, got it converted to the NATO rule of law support mission, and we had one Dane and one Dutch guy show up.
Two Poles.
So
a North Pole in Kabul and a South Pole in Kandahar.
Okay, so that was
the N and then Rolfson.
That was the N.
Yeah.
And when that happened, you saw the U.S. military. As soon as Martins went to Guantanamo Bay, he had requested, I think, 130 additional people with mobility support services that we would have really allowed them to aggressively ramp up stuff. That disappeared, and they began doing across-the-board withdrawal and cuts. And it has never changed since. And the same is true on the civilian side. I'm not going to say that everything that we did won't end up having a positive resolution, because I also agree with what my colleagues have said. I think we won't know that. We may know failure, but we won't know success for a while. But the realpolitik answer is everybody's gone by the end of 2014, pretty much.
What is the acceptance level of the Afghan people of the entire program? I know Dominic talked about the democrats, but that doesn't mean anything, because the democrats are probably 5% of the entire population. So, in general, what has been the acceptance level of the Afghan people of this entire program? The second question is that how does the system work exactly in terms of the application of the law? Do you apply the Afghan law for the most part of the time, and then it gets trumped when you have human rights issues, or does it apply all?
No, it was Afghan law all the time, except in detention facilities run by NATO, like Bagram, which is still a contentious issue. They were supposed to turn it over to the Afghans while I was there. That sort of said to happen, didn't happen, then happened, didn't happen. But Afghan law is what is applied.
Yeah, the point I think I would make is we helped as much as we could for the Afghans to implement their own system. And one of the clashes we really had is, as much as you want to, when you get off the plane and say, I will not look through a U.S. lens, okay? But it's hard not to, because you're very, very used to that, and you're raised in that system, and the European lawyers is the same way. But to answer your question, just to add what Scott said, it's Afghan law, because it's their country.
But Afghanistan is signatory to, a wide range of UN conventions, more than the U.S. actually, where they've signed the Convention on the Right to a Child. They've really stepped up, and I did a lot of work on. They're currently reforming the penal code, and so it's an international working group of Afghans and internationals who sit several times a week to literally parse out the penal code, which is in a draft form from 2004. The Afghans in that group are incredibly conscious of their obligations to the international community. So it actually comes up quite a lot, like, well, we also have to address our international obligation, our obligations under international law. That was it's fairly recurrent at a very high level. The guy in charge of that is a direct advisor to the president, and he was...
But to answer, your question is how well is it accepted? And my take on that was it depends on where you are. It depends on geographically.
Yeah, if you're Pashtun, you probably have one answer. If you're Hazara, it's different. I mean, you got to remember, Afghanistan is a country, quote unquote, but it has different nationalities, and the Dari Pashtun divide is serious. And even in the Pashtun areas, though, I would say, Karzai is a Pashtun, and there are pockets where it's well accepted. But I think Art's nailed it. I mean, if you go up to Mazar or Herat, the attitude is really different than Kandahar.
So Pashtun are not sort of receptive towards this, but Hazara.
Well, see, I don't think that's totally fair. The Hazaras have been notoriously discriminated against, right? So they look at the international community, much like women do, as an opportunity to to level the playing field. If you look at Pashtuns in Kandahar or Helmand, the ones associated with the formal justice system are very happy for international aid. They attend our training. I mean, for a while they were getting paid to attend the trainings, so you can take that for what it is. But they're very receptive. The people, there's also a group of people who are not associated with the formal justice system and don't necessarily see the Americans as sort of the best ever. But I have to tell you, I mean, I traveled a lot more in Afghanistan than I did in Iraq. But in Iraq, I saw a lot more anti-American. Resistance to sort of the international presence. I saw a lot more of that in Iraq than I saw in Afghanistan. Part of it is I think Iraq's civil society started with the fall of Saddam, and it was only the Americans, whereas Afghanistan has had 30, 40, 50 years of robust international community being present in Kabul, and there's definitely a sense that the aid that's associated with that and the ability to influence power, right? Like provinces that can show that they're poppy free are getting $1 million, a year. And if you want that $1 million, you're poppy free. And if that's less important to you, you're not poppy free, right? So you're not seeing that kind of resistance. I think Afghans are also, they're in some ways more international. Like it's interesting. It's a very interesting group of people. Which
is a really interesting and hopefully somewhat optimistic note to end the program. Unfortunately, we are past time. I'd like to invite the panelists, if you'd be willing to stay, we can continue the discussion informally, but let's thank everybody for coming.
Thank you.